Okay, so good morning, everybody, and thank you so much to all of you for joining us this morning. My name is Catalina Montoya. I'm the director of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Center for War and Peace Studies, and I would like to welcome you to this seminar series entitled Responding to Disruption, Government Populism, the Pandemic, and the Breakdown of Public Trust, organized by the Tutu Center, the Masters in Politics and International Relations, and the European Study at Liverpool Hope University. Now, what responses can be expected from international and national governments to reestablish trust in the efficacy of liberal and democratic politics? And what lessons, if any, have been learned? In this program of webinar Q&As, we have invited experts in their field to comment on pathways towards the reestablishment of public trust in a post-COVID, post-Brexit, and post-Trump environment. The Archbishop Desmond Tutu Center for War and Peace Studies is proud to bring together academics and practitioners who work on issues related to peace, war, and conflict from a variety of perspectives. The center promotes the benefit of drawing on interdisciplinary approaches to shed light on the multidimensional challenges that are faced by militarism and deeply divided societies. Now, today's talk is entitled Deference, Trust, Populism, and Contemporary British Politics. And our special guest is Catherine Marshall, Professor of British Studies at CY Sergi Paris University in France. This is formerly the University of Cergy Pontoise in France. Is director of the Agora Research Center and of the MA Political Ideas in a Digital Age. Her research focuses on the history of ideas in the second half of the 19th century. She also works on the development of political ideas in Victorian Britain and on the legacy in the 20th and 21st centuries. She is co-editor with Bernard Lightman and Richard England of a 3-volume critical edition on the papers of the Metaphysical Society and the Metaphysical Society. In Intellectual Life in Mid-Victorian England with OUP in 2019, and she also co-edited with Jean-Paul Rosset an issue of the journal Philosophical Enquiries on l'idealisme Britannique, so British idealism, and co-edit with Stefan Goy, The Victorian Legacy in Political Thought. This is a publication of Peter Lang, publishers in 2014. She has just published a monograph entitled Political Deference in a Democratic Age, which we'll be discussing today. And her next project will be on classical liberal Victorian women. So Professor Catherine Marshall will be in conversation with Professor Mike Mannin, who's honorary visiting professor in history, politics and international relations at Liverpool Hope University. Professor Mike Mannin is Jean Monnet Chair in European Studies at Personam at the University of Portsmouth and was director of his Jean Monnet Center for the Study of Transnational Europe from 2013 to 2016. He has published widely in the field of European politics, the politics and government of the European Union, and Europeanization as both a concept and application. He's an active member of the European movement, contributing to and analyzing the debates and process of Brexit negotiation. So after Catherine's presentation and conversation with Mike Mannin, we will open the session to questions from the audience. Again, many thanks for to Mike and Catherine to be here with us this morning. And without further ado, let's make a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Catalina, and thank you and welcome, Catherine, to virtual Liverpool, because I am also in Liverpool now. I've been in France for some time. I am also in Liverpool with Catalina. Can I, without any more hesitation, introduce you to the first question, and this is going to be a sort of a job interview question. The first question that you get in any job interview is, why do you want the job? Well, this question is, what led you to choose the concept of deference as a major factor in explaining British politics? Let's allow you the luxury of a nice, easy question, first of all.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to Liverpool Hope University and to Catalina Montoya Londoner for having invited me, and from Professor Mike Mannin for actually taking on the role of interviewer, and for all of us to be able to discuss this subject this morning. So essentially, I mean, the explanation, why did I decide to work on the concept of deference? Because when you look at it, when you look at the term itself, you may wonder if there is any point in actually spending 300 pages, I mean, trying to explain what deference is all about. So essentially, the word deference, if you think about this, for me, I come to this word as a French woman, and it is something that you do not normally see in France. The concept of deference in France would be something which is a slippery concept, which refers to an old term used in the 14th century, which means to yield, to refer to. But basically in France, the value it has is that this is something that you are doing, but it is not necessarily a perception in society of being equal to another. If you defer, it means that you accept the condition of your inequality. And everything started really because I wrote my PhD a long time ago now on the constitutional and political theory of Walter Bagehot. And Walter Bagehot in the 19th century, some of you must know about him. He wrote the English Constitution. I mean, he was also a journalist who was editor of The Economist for quite a long time in the middle of the 19th century. And that's the reason why today you've got a Bagehot page with his name if you read The Economist. But essentially, Walter Bagehot was using the concept of deference. And so when I wrote my PhD, I mean, I fully understood what he was talking about. And therefore, in the 20th century and 21st century, especially at the time of the Queen's Jubilee in 2012, I started being rather concerned by the way in which the concept was being used. And you had certain sentences such as that the British were a deferential nation, or you would always say, you would find certain things such as the British defer to the Queen. And I was very, I mean, amazed and also rather upset by the fact that the term itself had a definition, the definition Bagehot had given in the 19th century, and I will come to this in a minute. But basically, if you looked at what was being said at the time of the Jubilee, what you had was that the British were supposed to represent something. And if you are British, you do know that essentially there are 4 nations, and that the concept of Britishness has never been fully defined, and that is very complicated to define. And so that the British as a nation, as something constitutes, I mean, as a constitution of a group with the same set of values, which I thought was impossible, were actually willing to defer. And the term itself was being used as a way of saying that they accepted the crown. And so this bothered me. And I started thinking about this. And then it's like, you know, with a sort of obsession, you can see the term coming up everywhere. And then suddenly I realized that the term was used in different ways, and that the concept of deference had a value as a political tool, which had been left aside, considered as being basically pejorative, paternalistic even. Okay, that was and incomprehensible, because basically a number of political scientists would consider that if you could not calculate deference, therefore as an analytical tool, it had no political value. Whereas for me, political deference was based on what Bagehot was saying. And I don't necessarily agree with everything he was saying, but Walter Bagehot was essentially saying that political deference was an essential condition of political stability in an uncodified constitution. And so this was really, I thought, the major aspect, the major role of political deference in an uncodified structure such as the Anglo-British Constitution. And that if you did not have political deference, you didn't have the glue to actually bring together a number of pillars of the Constitution, which would not have been held without this. So I can actually perhaps say a bit more if you want.
No, that's fine. That's a good enough reason you've got the job. That's okay. But you do point out that rightly, I believe that deference is within any political system and is an important part of stability of that political system. Yet you say that it's unique to each political system. What do you mean by this? Because basically you've got a concept which is ubiquitous, but you're saying it's unique to each system. So a little explanation of that.
So essentially, as I started working on the Anglo-British Constitution, and I will carry on calling it in this way, because I believe that essentially there is an English structure, an English understanding of the Constitution, which has been superimposed to the nations throughout the Anglo-British Constitution. So I think that the term in itself is very important. And I also think that perhaps it's also important to say something else, which is that, which for you British people is perhaps natural, but when you are French or if you're American, when you're talking about a constitution, you're normally talking about a book, something which is a code, something which is codified that you can refer to. So let's say that tomorrow, if I had the desire to become French president, I would actually know that I can refer to the Constitution of 1958 and look into the rules and into the nature of the Constitution. And I can find this in a constitutional code. Whereas in fact, if you are British, you do not have a codified constitution. You find the sources of the Constitution in a number of sources, some of which are written, some of which are not. Some, for example, you have constitutional conventions which are not written. And so for me, coming to this, as a French person, I was always fascinated by the way in which the British were able to politically breathe without having a constitutional code to which they could refer in a very theoretical and rational way. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I find this fascinating is because, in fact, how do you actually understand authority? How do you understand the delegation of your power to a political elite if you actually haven't got a book or a constitutional code to which you can refer? And amazingly enough, the British haven't got a constitutional code to which they can refer, and it still works. So how do you actually get the people to agree to live in such a constitution if you haven't got anything to explain what this is? Basically, you have to make up the codes as you go along. So what I did find fascinating is that, obviously enough, in the 19th century, because I'm a Victorianist, what Walter Bagehot was explaining is that this could work because essentially you had this glue, and this glue was political deference, meaning that people respected their institutions because of the value they had lying on their past. So what Walter Bagehot was saying was that there was something in the very nature of the English national character. So I'm very aware that those expressions today are old-fashioned, are not politically correct. But put yourself back into the 19th century, and if you think about Walter Bagehot's writing at the time when he's using an evolutionary vocabulary, basically what he's saying is that in the same way Lamarck, so just before Darwin, was talking about the evolution of nature and the Constitution, and basically that you keep the characteristics as you evolve. Walter Bagehot was saying that essentially through the evolution of the institutions of Britain, there had been slowly but gradually the acquisition of what he called a cake of customs, so customs, and then those customs would actually allow people to have sort of rails, and out of those rails, people could then evolve, and then this would generate a structure and a system in which this national character would be conducive to liking customs, and would also be conducive to protecting things which had been valuable to the nation. So in this case, of course, Bagehot is talking about the crown, is talking about the evolution of the monarchy. And so what Bagehot was saying is that out of this hierarchical structure, in a sort of evolution, came out in the 19th century democratic questions. And even though he was opposed to the extension of the suffrage, he was fully aware, like a number of commentators at the time, that there would be no way of stopping it. So he was aware that there was something in the English national character which would protect the institutions because of the value of their past. And that's the reason why I think that in Walter Bagehot and in his concept of political deference, you find something which is very Anglo-British, okay, but I would say English, okay, because it is the domination of one nation, England, over the other. Okay, I think that this is something we will come to in a moment.
Sure.
And so basically the reverence for the past, the reverence for the past institutions, a sort of pragmatism based on common sense, and also, I think, a love of debate and a love of government by discussion. And you can see it in the nature, for example, of your parliament. If you actually look at your parliament, you can see that unlike the French parliament or unlike the American Congress, you actually have a structure of a house in which you've got the government and the opposition, and in which you actually have the structure of the house in which you speak to each other. Whereas in fact, if you think about the organization of the French parliament, basically what you got is a half circle structure in which you do not necessarily speak to each other. So even in the conception of the building, there is something different in the way in which you are going to consider the way in which you talk about politics. And so therefore, yes, I believe that there is something in the nature of the English, national character, the way Bagehot understood it, which was conducive to this political deference, which is a condition of political stability in an uncodified constitution. Now, you're right to point out to the fact that I do say that deference is something that exists. And that was my problem, is that the people who normally refer to deference are sociologists. And so my main problem was, obviously enough, I work in intellectual history. I was here facing the fact that the concept of political deference was rejected by political scientists because you could not calculate it. And especially it was rejected in the 20th century, especially throughout the 1970s, especially as a useless analytical tool. But then there are a number of thinkers, especially sociologists, and here you can take the figure of Edward Shields, an extraordinary, short article called Deference in 1968, and in which he pointed out to something which I thought has been totally forgotten and has to be mentioned, is that he said that in life, and he was also talking about democracies, is that in life, there is a sort of human need to defer to others. So what he was saying is that even if in democracies there's been a sort of attenuation of deference, because basically there is a sort of equalizing nature of democracies, what he was saying is that if you reject deference because it's supposed to be paternalistic or pejorative, basically you are making a mistake, because you are not realizing that in human interactions, you do need what is going to be recognition. So basically appreciation, okay, of me for you, Mike, but it could also be rejection, okay, for me, for Donald Trump, for example. But in doing this, you are actually recognizing who you are, where you stand, and who you are actually going to defer to. So in my case, me to you, Mike, to your work, because then in fact, I'm going to actually adjust myself to what you have done through your life and through your work and think, okay, this is what I want to be. And then this is going to act as a sort of mirror effect. So you're going to act accordingly, or you're going to react against this. And so basically what Shields is saying is that equality, full equality, is impossible, because even an anarchist is going to defer to the books which have inspired him.
Oh, sure.
And so basically what Shields is saying is that if you transfer this into, well, he's not saying this, I'm saying this, that if you transfer this way of thinking to democracies, you're actually transferring a way of thinking recognition, which is based on the language of civility, which is based on reaching compromise, which is based on the language of conciliation, arbitration. And basically, if you're going to refuse deference on the grounds that it is outdated for democratic societies, basically, I think you're missing the point. And I think this is what happened in the 20th century with the Labour Party. By rejecting political deference as something hierarchical, as something based on Victorian values, you throw away the baby, you throw away the water and the baby together.
At the same time, yeah, absolutely agreed. Fine, so let's just pursue that just a little more, because this leads us on to basically your conceptual methodology, and you start to distinguish between different types of deference. So can you say a little word about the nature of your methodology by telling us what is the difference between, for instance, hierarchical deference and egalitarian deference, which I suspect you might actually introduce as an American and French concept, the latter anyway, egalitarian deference. So can you say a little word about the way you have approached the subject in order to give it a conceptual base? Yeah,
absolutely. So I'm going to share here with you all my screen, because I think perhaps it's easier for you to understand if I actually show you where I was going from and where I was going to. So hang on, if I can put it, normally you should be able to see it.
It's here, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So basically, as I had started, what I was thinking about initially was hierarchical deference. Okay, so, but then with the explanation of Edward Shields, I found myself in the position thinking, okay, but France and America, for example, are not in a structure in which they use political deference, because they will not use the term, or if they use it, as we said, in a pejorative way. But I realized rather quickly that there is an egalitarian form of deference. So if you can bear with me here, if you can follow my reflection, was that I started with political deference on the left. And of course, the core of my book is what you've got in yellow, but I'm going to reach this in a moment. So essentially, you've got to distinguish between, so first of all, if you start with political deference, you're going to distinguish between two types of deferences. The first one is going to be hierarchical, so the one we've just been mentioning. And this is historical in its origin. Essentially, what you've got here, if in the case of the United Kingdom, I think is a very good example. It is a structure of power based on a hierarchical structure, which has moved throughout the centuries. So where you are today in Britain is that you have to make a democratic structure match what are the remains of an aristocratic structure. And that's the problem, I think, because I don't think you're out of it. But if you take France, for example, or if you take, I think the best example here would be the United States of America. They didn't start with a hierarchical structure, because essentially they were based on the fact that they would cut themselves from the mother country with the American Revolution of the 18th century. And their starting position was on an equal starting position. So the whole point of the way in which they structured the organization of power was, of course, that they decided that people would be equal. So obviously enough, here there is an elephant in the room. If you were a slave or if you were a woman, your position was obviously enough not based on the same equal starting position. But you do understand that the terms, the vocabulary which was used was the vocabulary based on this equal starting position as the creation of this society. So basically, if you take the United States of America, here, what you have got is a structure of power which is going to move on based on what would be a voluntary deference, which is democratic by nature, for the institutions, and it is based on a rational understanding of the American Constitution, and it is based on independent choice. So you've got here something which is really rather linear. You start with 1776. I mean, there is a voluntary deference, even though the term is not very used, but it is used. We're going to see this perhaps later. It is democratic by nature, and it is based on this rational understanding of the institutions, the American institutions, and it is based on independent choice. Okay, so if you consider the British structure, this is different. Okay, so we understood that it is hierarchical, it is historical in its origins, and then in fact, there are two ways of seeing this. The first one is that you could have, and this is the case that Walter Bagehot explains, he doesn't use the term involuntary, okay? This typology of deference is mine. But this is what he means. Essentially, if you've got the early societies of very hierarchical societies, you have a form of deference to power, but it is involuntary. Basically here, it is the situation in which you are going to accept the power of the leader of the clan, because basically there is no other choice. You cannot lead your life out of this society. And basically here, as a woman especially, or as a man, your deference is going to be coercive. Okay, you are coerced into deferring to this type of power. But what I'm interested in, of course, is this yellow part here, is that if you move on into, especially after the 18th century, if you move on towards what is understanding authority as being reciprocal obligations, mutual respect, if you move on to understanding how you delegate power to your political elite, here you move on to a type of hierarchical voluntary deference. And here you've got two ways. It splits in two ways again. So you've got irrational, voluntary irrational deference. Irrational, why? Because you don't even think about it, okay? It's because you are traditionally going to voluntarily defer to the crown. So this is the case in the 19th century of a number of people who are not even thinking about how and why they are in the structure. And based on your customs, you are going to believe that, well, in using the Bagehot vocabulary, that the dignified parts of the Constitution, so the dignified part being the monarchy in the House of Lords, in fact, are there in order to hide the efficient parts of power, the House of Commons and the Cabinet. And basically what you've got is this tension between dignified parts and efficient parts allows people who are not sufficiently politically educated to actually think that power is held by the crown or by the monarch. So irrationally, you defer without even thinking about the nature of why you defer. But then, obviously enough, there were always people, who would rationally, based on their independent choice, who would rationally defer to power. And so here, of course, there are people who understand the working of the Constitution, who understand that the true key to power are the efficient parts in the 19th century, and that the secret of the Constitution, well, is the Cabinet in the fusion of the powers of the legislative and the executive. So basically, what I was really focusing on in the book was how, from the 18th century, and I started really with, well, essentially, the two key actors here are Smith and Burke. Of course, Burke understands traditions and customs in a way, he wants to show how, in fact, there is this long recognition of institutions based on this love of tradition. And so, for example, if you take Burke going against the French Revolution of 1789, it is precisely because, in fact, the French are not able to respect that past. And then Smith, for me, Adam Smith, comes out with an understanding of the notion of sympathy. So this sort of reciprocal, it's a bit very much this reciprocal understanding of others. You look at somebody and you adjust your way of thinking or doing because you have got this recognition of the person and of yourself. And Smith, I think, in very unclear yet terms, is actually showing that in commercial societies, you might not need the language of authority. You might actually just rely on exchanges and on this language of sympathy, or in order to adjust, to stabilize I mean, power. I mean, was not power, but societies, commercial societies. So what I saw really coming into the 19th century, what Bagehot was defining as the rational, well, and irrational, he doesn't use the term, but that's what it is, okay? Rational and irrational deference was really thinking about the mores, the nature of the society on which you can have such an uncodified constitution thriving. And then this took me into the 20th and 21st century. And this is not something I had expected, because initially I thought, okay, I'm just going to focus on the typologies of deference and voluntary rational and irrational deference in the 19th century, because this worked perfectly. It also worked with other thinkers such as Disraeli and Dicey, but we can mention this in a moment. But then I realized that, in fact, however much I didn't want to get into the 20th and 21st century, the language of deference was still used in the 20th and 21st century, but then it was used for different reasons. And what I could see was a history of the histories of deference, that you had snapshots in which you could see deference alive and then dying or not being active. And then I realized that it was a really valuable analytical tool which had been discarded, and that I think it should be retrieved. And then I got into something I had not expected, which was to get into a second part of the book, which was really much more political and not based on the methodologies I had used, because essentially in the 19th century, I could use what was the methodology of intellectual history and focus with a sort of a toolbox on the ways in which deference appeared, and I could actually use primary sources, which were extraordinarily useful. But then moving into the 21st and especially 21st century, I was moving into what was really dangerous territory, because there was no longer, for me, the possibility of using intellectual history. There I was moving into basically the language of political science without having the analytical tools to do so. So I was on very shaky grounds, and that's the reason why the book can be attacked for actually, well, having used two methodologies, which normally would be heresy for any historian. But at the same time, I do believe that there is a value to the concept to understand where we are today.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think really we should get on to the dangerous territory that you're talking about, because if we try to apply your yellow squares to British politics in the 21st century, then I think this is really what fascinated me, the fact that we have to apply this concept to explain a lot of what's happened very, very recently. So one thing we haven't talked about too much is the role of the British monarchy, which would suggest that there is a unique element to the notion of deference in this country, because I don't think there is another monarchy quite like the British monarchy, quite like, there's loads of monarchies, but nothing quite like the British monarchy. But secondly, and that sort of ties in with your notion of irrationality associated with deference, I think. Perhaps not, I don't know. You need to perhaps comment on that one. I would also like to tie that into the position of the attempt at radical change in British. In other words, a moving away from irrational deference towards rational deference, and perhaps even towards egalitarian deference. And the institution that has tried to do that most, but succeeded only in part, is the Labour Party. So can I ask the big question, I think, and that is that when the Labour Party has come to power, it has tried to establish a much more egalitarian notion of politics, and therefore challenges the whole basis of irrational deference. Now, is this down to the permanent and pervasive institution of the monarchy, which actually is the Labour Party is beating itself against every time? And as you say, from Keir Hardy, perhaps right the way through to Keir Starmer, certainly through to Corbyn, deference to the monarchy has been eventually part of what they've had to do. And therefore, in a sense, any attempt to move sociologically away from the irrationality of deference has been thwarted, particularly by this hurdle, this barrier, I would call it, of the British monarchy.
It's the two questions are linked. The two questions are linked. So, I mean, so first of all, I think that Bagehot was wrong in saying that that through political education, Britain would actually move out for a sort of irrational deference for the monarchy. And I think that it is certainly his greatest mistake, in the sense that what he had analyzed, he had not fully applied. Essentially, he believed that Britain at the time was a disguised republic, and that France was a disguised monarchy. And in this sense, I think he's quite right, and I think it's still in fact the case today. But what he had missed out on is that you can actually have an irrational love for the monarchy, but you can also have a rational love for it. And that's where, in fact, I think he missed the point, is that he didn't realize that throughout the 20th century and the 21st century, essentially the institution of the monarchy would be able to adapt, and to adapt ruthlessly, okay? The capacity of the British monarchy to adapt in order to survive has absolutely astounded me over the 20th century, from the moment when they refused to save the Tsar and his family, to changing their name to the Windsor in order not to sound German, to actually getting rid of a monarch who would abdicate, to actually really pushing aside anybody who would actually be dangerous for the institution of the monarchy. You can see this today with the way in which Prince Edward is pushed aside, and how Prince Harry is also sidelined. And you can see that the monarchy has got this great capacity to adapt in order to survive. So, but there is something in this institution of this monarchy which is so old, so valued, and especially which has got, if you take the case of Elizabeth II, who has been a monarch who has been nearly 70 years in power, who is the living memory, the living link that you can touch to Churchill, her first prime minister, and somebody who has devoted her life to her country in a way that I'm not sure any president would, or any future monarch will, because it is such a difficult role. So essentially, the problem for the Labour Party is that it grates that if you are fundamentally in favor of equality, and you're not necessarily going to put liberty first, but you're going to put equality first, there is something in the very notion of a constitutional monarchy which grates your values. But where they missed the point is that you can actually be rationally deferential to the crown, because you choose to accept something which is based on your independent choice, that you like the fact that it can be a very stabilizing structure, and you can also accept that a monarch like Elizabeth II has done a huge amount of good for the country. But a number of people, Jeremy Corbyn, for example, would have been offended by what I've just said. But in the end, a number of Labour members do actually rationally like the monarchy. And that's why I think that the Labour Party has not really understood the point that by wanting to get rid of deference, what they were wanting to get rid of was irrational deference. What they wanted to do was essentially to really get rid of the aristocratic structure of society. But by getting rid of the aristocratic structure of society, what they do not see is that you are actually also therefore not seeing the constitutional value of political deference. And I think that this is really the very big problem for the Labour Party in the 20th century. And you can see it, I think, in what happened in the reconstruction of the British Constitution under New Labour. If you take a figure like Tony Blair, and if you take New Labour, what they were trying to do by also using part of the constitutional program of Charter 88 was believing that if you wanted to give a better understanding of the British Constitution to the people, you had to codify it. And it's not stupid in itself. I mean, this meant that they wanted to get rid of a hierarchical, old-fashioned structure which worked like a club. And this really bothered them. So what they were trying to say was that essentially, if you could codify part of the Constitution and make it clearer, then in fact, you would make it clearer for the people to understand and to participate into political life. However, I think that they did the opposite. I think that through the constitutional reconstruction of the United Kingdom after 1997, they deformed, it's not my term, it's a constitutionalist who used this term, and I think it's the right term. They deformed the British Constitution in a worst way, basically by bringing devolution in 1998, by trying to reform the House of Lords, but this is only in the first stage, not even in the second, by incorporating British law, incorporating into British law the Human Rights Act, by scrapping the office of the Lord Chancellor, by creating a Supreme Court, by wanting a directly elected Mayor of London, and by using different types of votes, from using proportional representation for the elections of the devolved assemblies, having proportional representation for the London Assembly, and at the same time having a first past the post system at the time of general elections. What you are doing, if you are not a political scientist student or somebody interested in politics, is that you're making the system even more incomprehensible. And that's why I think that the system, which was already perhaps not easy to understand, has been even more deformed. And basically, what Brexit has exposed, what Brexit has actually put the light on, is precisely this problem, is that they thought that basically the membership of the European Union was the problem. But I believe that the problem was that that membership of the Union was actually helping to sort of cover up nicely what was essentially the divisions within the United Kingdom and the problems of this deformed constitution. So for me, Brexit is not something which happened like that, like in 2016. Brexit is the consequence of a misunderstanding of the role of political deference in the uncodified constitution, and of what essentially has been a realignment of British politics after 2013 and 2014, and which has been denied, but it appears today. So Brexit is only a landmark in what is essentially a long history, but we couldn't see it before because we didn't have the benefit of hindsight. Even when I was writing the book, you could see that this was what had happened, but it was a sort of shadow. It was appearing. It's not yet appeared. And even as we're discussing this now today, and this is something that, Mike, when you came to my university and you discussed Brexit, you made clear to me that this shadow was appearing of this realignment of British politics, which is transforming Britain. And it's not yet, it's in the making. It's not yet out.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's where we are.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you've actually moved on to my last question and made some comments which I think we can follow up perhaps with the audience, because my last question was, how does deference help to explain where we are today, the Brexit and the 2019 election and Boris Johnson, etc., etc. As you were talking, especially when the diagram was there, I thought we could just add the word trust, deference and trust, because deference depends on trust, the trust factor. And this is one of the subjects of our seminar series. So I think we have been discussing the nature of trust through the notion of deference throughout, and the breakdown of trust, which I think is a significant part of where we are now in British politics. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop there because time is getting on, and I obviously I want to make an opportunity for colleagues to question or to comment now. So over to Catalina, perhaps to organise that little bit of it for me, please. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Catherine.
Okay, so yeah.
I thought you weren't there for a minute.
Yes.
Good.
Catalina, if you want, if there are no questions on this part,
so we do have a couple of them. The first one has to do with prorogation. It's by Dr. Steve Hills. And he talks about the prorogation fiasco. And his question is, didn't the prorogation fiasco show deference to the monarchy no longer exists, even in the Tory party?
In fact, this is it's exactly that. It's perfect because it's exactly what I wanted to say. So thank you very much for the question. Essentially, I mean, in the last 4 years, okay, from Brexit to we've had so many moments which have been landmarks that in fact we've had so much that it has been complicated to actually see how things were going. But my feeling is that Boris Johnson, in fact, used the language of the freeborn Englishman. And so basically he retrieved a sort of language of popular constitutionalism, which was at the heart of what Disraeli believed in the 19th century. But I won't say anything about this now. But anyway, basically what he did is that he rationally wanted to retrieve this language of deference. But basically he did it by throwing away an aspect of political deference which was there in the 19th century and which was still there in the 20th century, which is the ethics of deference. Because essentially what Boris Johnson is doing is populism. He is actually, in my view, he is using a number of ideas and values and political vocabulary, but he is transforming that political vocabulary to fit his views. So you have got this, for example, in his understanding of one nation conservatism, that it means something very precise for him. But essentially, what happened at the time of the prorogation of Parliament and the fiasco was that there was a desire to say that you are actually going to rationally defer to the Constitution, but what you would be doing is that you would be subverting the Constitution in the process. So the battle which took place at the time of the prorogation of Parliament was still a battle between rational and irrational deference. There were a number of people who really, through a sort of a love for official constitutionalism, fought against what was happening, and that's why Gina Miller a second time took the case to the Supreme Court. And I think that what you saw in this battle was also a battle between politics and the power of the judges, which was also something which was at the heart of the problem of Brexit, is that through Brexit, you had the criticism of the fact that the European Union had forced Britain to codify certain aspects of its law and given more power to the judges. So there was also this battle going on. But what happened is that the Supreme Court showed very clearly that Boris Johnson was using the vocabulary of rational deference to his own benefit, and this was essentially dangerous. So you can see that, in fact, there were people who were deferential to what it meant to have an uncodified structure, and that the prorogation of Parliament could not take place like that just because the executive wanted this to happen. So for me, Boris Johnson is dangerous because he has got an understanding of the constitutional language, but he doesn't consider that he has to have an ethics of deference.
Mm.
And I think that this is what is really the problem today, is that Boris Johnson, by the general election of 2019, showed that he could push aside a huge amount of people who had been Remainers in order to be certain that the Conservative Party would be reconstructed around what he wanted. And it's essentially a Conservative Party which is today having people who are Brexiteers, but he's also been able to have a number of people who were Labour people in all constituencies and who feel that they've been rejected by the cosmopolitan liberals, which means that there is no longer a breathing space for the Labour Party. And you can see it you can see that this happened in the May general election, in which you can see that somebody like Keir Starmer is no longer finding the breathing space, because essentially he's stuck between those two sides, which is now this Conservative Party, which has been realigned and reconstructed. And so the question would be, how do you re-enchant politics with what would be an ethics of deference, which would be the language of civility, the language of discussion, the language of conciliation. And that's where I think we are. And I think that's, I haven't got a solution except that moderation, moderation, government by discussion are essential, and fighting through politics is essential.
There is a response here by Dr. Steve Hills, a reaction to this. He says, "Thank you, Catherine. Isn't the most rational part of deference respect for the law? And that's exactly what Johnson is actively undermining."
Yes, and that's why, in fact, I'm saying that Boris Johnson is using the language of rational deference, but in fact is misusing it. And that's why I think there is an element of populism in Boris Johnson, which is remarkably dangerous. And that is not fully questioned. I don't know how, and I hope that this answers the question of my colleague, and I really thank him for this question, because it is part of, I think, of the problem with Johnson, is that he's actually thinking about himself, and that he's an odd type of politician. I mean, I find him fundamentally slippery, and slippery also in his conception of politics. You know, I defy anybody to tell me really what Johnsonism is all about.
Johnson.
Yes.
Johnson, that's what it's about, and, Johnson.
You know, when I actually read, for example, a speech like the New Year's speech, in which he talks about the fact that he wants a new Green Deal, and I think to myself, you cannot please everybody. You cannot please provincial conservatives, nor can you please the former Labour people who voted in favor of Brexit and who voted conservative, nor can you please the cosmopolitan liberals of London. At one stage, you will have to actually displease somebody. Yes. And there's going to be crunch time at one stage.
Yes. I wonder what colour red, green and blue actually makes, because he's placating these different groups. It's quite a mess, isn't it?
He's actually catering to those different groups by saying, yes, the same way he actually said the same thing at the time when he said there wouldn't be a hard border in Northern Ireland. You know, you end up thinking at one stage you have to actually define what you believe in. And you stand for it, but it's not very clear. And also I'm concerned about the fact that he is living with somebody who is very cosmopolitan liberal of you know, in favor of environment. Kerry Simmons is also a totally different type of conservative to the conservatives who voted for him at the general election of 2019. So I have got those questions which bother me, and in fact, this is leading to, but I'm not sure yet, is to a full destruction of the language of deference.
Possibly, yeah, you may be right, but I think there's another question. Kathleen. I think
yes, we have a couple more. Why? And this is Paul Friendly, and thank you Paul for joining us this morning. Why does the British monarchy induce irrational deference more so than other existing European monarchies?
In fact, it's a question. I mean, I had talking to some of my colleagues talking about the Spanish monarchy, and you can see that I would not say that irrational deference for the British monarchy is more marked. I mean, if you take, for example, the Spanish monarchy, you can see that Juan Carlos was pushed out of his role, was forced to abdicate out of shame. But basically, the Spanish did keep on his son, Prince Felipe, well, he became King Felipe, and that he had a major impact, especially at the time when you had the problems with Catalonia. And I would say that it's not only the British monarchy, but it is particularly, you can particularly see it in the British monarchy. So for example, I was struck by how much the message of the Queen in April last year, when we were all confined, was much more powerful than the message of a politician. I was extreme, because in fact, what you had was an old queen who was herself confined away from her loved ones, and who was actually talking the language of, we will survive this, we will meet again, using a sort of vocabulary which was reminiscent of the Second World War. And that was an aspect, she can unite the nations of the UK much better than any politician. Because, I mean, but the thing is, I wonder to what extent this will carry on with her children. You can see with the enterprise of diplomacy of Prince William going to Scotland last week that he is trying very hard to keep what is essentially this love for Scotland especially. But I'm wondering, the real question I think for the UK today is, where are you as nations? Or is there anything which can be really today understood as Britishness? When I see the ways in which Northern Ireland and Scotland are in real true opposition to the language of the Anglo-British Constitution, and you can see how devolution, instead of actually putting an end to those questions of nationalism, have actually well, given fire to them. I wonder where this is going to go. And also, my sadness is that I understand why Britain left the European Union, but also I understand the fact that it was perhaps too complicated for the British to understand a theoretical, rational, continental project when they themselves are part of a union which is not easy to understand.
Thank you so much for that. If you allow me a question, I'm really interested on, you partly have kind of referred to nations, but also I'll be really interested in your thoughts about British international leadership led by, you know, this kind of English notion of projection. So what are your thoughts here? So this global Britain and this kind of...
I knew you were going to use the term global Britain.
Yes.
I think that there's a form of delusion, but not only of Britain. I think that of every single country on the planet, that there is something which has happened with globalization of power. With globalization, is that power, in fact, has been diffused, even more diffused. So the way in which you could look up to a politician in the 19th century or beginning of the 20th century, or even in the first, I mean, you know, the end of the 20th century, thinking that in fact that politician had a huge amount of power, meant that it would entertain this political deference. The problem is today, if you take any politician, you realize that fundamentally they have got they haven't got much power. That in a globalized world, every single politician is the victim, or is in a position in which the globalization of the structures means that you cannot control power or politics the way you used to. So I think that the idea of a global Britain is a lovely idea, because obviously enough, if you take only the English language, you know, well, if you take Spanish too, okay. But the problem is, I think that it's again a form of delusion, and I'm particularly concerned by the fact that Britain could really focus on its own only. You know, when you actually see that that in the future, what is going to matter are those big powers, I really question the reasons why Britain left the European Union. I do understand that they were not happy in it, but what is going to matter are those big superstructures, and what is going to be global Britain if you've got Russia, the United States, the European Union, India, China, and Brazil. You cannot be. And so I think this is a language of the past, and it's also a language which is relying on what Britain used to be, and that it would be so much better if Britain in the future rejoined the European Union, but this time with the true desire of understanding that this is useful for all of us. And when I say this, I really truly believe that Britain, having left the European Union, is dangerous for what is the domination of the French and German couple. That there was an element of common sense which was brought by the United Kingdom, which was a necessity. And the fact that they have gone is really very bad for us. It's a bad divorce, and we are the children of that divorce.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for this. Mike, you want to make some closing remarks? There are no more questions in your Q&A.
From Catherine's book here, Budget. I think we should finish with Budget and an explanation of where British politics is right now, or should I say English politics. And Budget writes, and I quote, "I need not say that in real sound stupidity, the English are unrivaled." I know he goes on to talk about other things, but that might be one of the major explanations for why British politics is like it is right now. Sorry, to finish on a trivial.
But Budget considers stupidity as a quality.
Absolutely, I've got another aspect to that quote as well, because it leads to stability, political stability. But anyway, sorry.
No, absolutely, and he says that the French are a nation of philosophers, but that's why they are unstable, and I think he's right. And so
that's it.
Let's finish on Budget. Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much.
Can I give my thanks to you, Catherine, in the historical tradition of foreign explanations of British politics, such as Montesquieu and Eleve. You are in that mold. It was brilliant. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you. You're far too kind. Thank you very much, and thank you for the audience for the questions.
Thank you, Professor Catherine Marshall, Professor Mike Mannin, and to all of our attendees. We'll be posting or the talk and our next events. So thank you again to everybody this morning. It has been a really great talk.